Welcome to episode 7 of the Mindset Advantage podcast with Dr. Tricia Cardner and Elliot Rose. So, Tricia, you've got another fact for us this week. What have you got?
I got a little psychology news we can all use, and this one is a tasty little bit. Recently, a study was published in the Journal of Nutrition, Health, and Aging, and they found that if you eat a handful of walnuts each day, it improves memory, concentration, and the speed at which the brain processes information.
Wow, that sounds like quite a cheap fix.
It's a very cheap fix. And what was interesting about this study is they looked at all age groups. They had people from age 20 to age 90, and it was across the board. People who ate the walnuts had improved cognitive performance. So we don't exactly know why they're beneficial as yet, but there's a lot of possibilities because they're high in antioxidants. They're high in ALA, which is alpha linolenic acid, and then they have a ton of other vitamins and nutrients. But at the end of the day, if poker players are looking for a good little snack that might help their brain work a little better, walnuts seem to be the answer.
Excellent. So put down the candy bars out there and go and get some walnuts, and you'll win more money. It's that simple. Right, so on today's show, we've got Zach Elwood. He's coming on. He's the writer of Reading Poker Tells and Reading Verbal Tells. And we thought we'd have him on the show just to give another side of one of these niche parts of poker where people can really improve their game by just learning a small amount of information that might allow them to reduce any tells that they're giving, or perhaps, if you're lucky enough, see a tell an opponent that might print you some money over the series. So here we'll just give Zach a call. So Zach, thanks for coming on the show. If you could just introduce yourself to our listeners.
I'm Zach Elwood, and I wrote a couple books on Poker Tells. I wrote Reading Poker Tells, which was released in 2012, and then Verbal Poker Tells, which was released last year in 2014. And I've kept a blog for a few years at readingpokertells.com, and I write for Bluff Magazine. I write a monthly column, a little bit less frequently now that they're only online, but I write a Poker Tells column for them. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. And I used to play professionally. I don't do so anymore, but I played professionally for 3 years, and that's pretty much it.
And where did the decision to move into Poker Tells come from? Because it's obviously a very niche market.
I think mainly it was because for the reason that when I looked at the books that were out there, the books that I had read, Caro's and Navarro's, mainly it was a reaction to feeling like the work that was being done on Poker Tells wasn't living up to what I thought it could be. And back when I played for a living, which was around 2003 to 2006, I was always thinking, there could be more done on Poker Tells, and I had ideas of, things I'd use and things that I'd talk to people about, and some things that I knew about that I'd never seen written about. So I'd always kind of had this idea in my mind, maybe I could write a book, but I was always thinking, somebody else more experienced is going to write it, And so then, a few years later, nobody had written such a book, and so I was like, okay, I guess I'll try doing it. So that's pretty much what led to it, and it wasn't like I thought I was a genius at Poker Tells or anything. It was more like, I thought that I would be able to write about some things that nobody had ever written about before, and it wasn't like I thought that I was writing about things that nobody ever thought about before, because I know from experience that people think about these things, but it was more like, I guess I'll be the guy to try to communicate this to the masses.
So, you've had so much experience just looking at poker tells. What kind of tells just surprise you the most when you see them?
I guess, the really obvious tells are always surprising, because some of the really obvious ones you're kind of like, wow, are people really going to be this obvious about it? Sometimes you see, like, I guess an example would be, defensively playing with your chips, like you're going to call a bet or something, or, that's one major one you see at, a lot of 1-2 games, is somebody threatens to put the call in, when you're thinking of betting, and that's just always going to be weak. I mean, they might still end up calling you, of course, which sometimes they do. But, it's always surprising, you see it at a 2-5 game or higher, and you're like, and then I've definitely seen it at significantly higher stakes, and you're kind of thinking like, wow, is this person really playing at these stakes? And it seems to be a regular player and is still doing this, So I'd say like that kind of thing is most surprising, to me.
And I know you ended up working with one of the players for November 9, didn't you? If you could tell us about that.
Amir Lahavit, he was in the 2013 WSOP main event. I was very flattered to get a call from him not long before the November 9 was taking place, the final table. And he had read my book, I guess, in preparation for the final table, and he wanted me to act as a Poker Tells consultant, basically, and study his opponents and himself. The existing footage leading up to the final table that existed, which wasn't that much for most of the players, and also during the final table we had a Skype group that I would Skype my thoughts to every once in a while.
That must have been a pretty exciting night.
Yeah, it was. I'm not at the place, not at the auditorium, but I was in a hotel room watching, and I was just Skyping my thoughts occasionally. But yeah, it was exciting, and it was great to be a part of it. And he's a great player. Arguably was the best tournament player at that table that night. He had a lot of experience online and live. And it was just really flattering to be asked by him to do that, because as far as I know, that was the only time anyone's ever been asked to specifically do that, as far as I know.
So did you pick up anything like super juicy that you can tell us about?
There were things that I thought were probably relevant. The thing is, it was such a small sample size that was the main problem. It's like we had a few hands, from the previous WSOP footage, and I focused on the players that I thought would be likely to have the most relevant or the most meaningful and practical patterns. I focused on the players that were least experienced live and least experienced playing wise, because I thought that would be the biggest payoff. Mm-hmm. And there were a few patterns I thought were reliable, and I actually wrote a couple of blog posts about it. But, the problem was, and Amir and I both agreed it was a long shot that we'd find anything, that would be a big game changer. It was more like he wanted to cover that base, because he had actually seen I can't remember now. He had seen an analysis I did of a previous WSOP champ, Pius Hines, where I found a pretty reliable behavior from him, a couple of years before. I think that was 2011, I think, where I found a pretty reliable eye contact tell from him. And so, I think the dot was, if I found anything remotely similar to that, it could be a, significant game changer if he got in the right position. Unfortunately, Amir was pretty short stacked for most of the final table. He got in one hand early on that kind of crippled him. So he was basically in shover fold mode, pre-flop for most of the game. So, even if I had a super reliable tell, which I didn't really, it wouldn't have a chance to come into play.
And do you get those players? So you release an article like that showing someone's tell. Do they thank you afterwards for pointing a mistake out that they were making, or are they really angry that you've just informed the whole world what they do wrong?
Well, I've never really had anybody, say anything bad about it. Like I've posted quite a few analysis of people. My thought is most of the time the things I'm talking about they probably already figured out on their own. Like for example, I wrote a blog post about Sylvain Loosely, who was the French player at the 2013 WSOP final table. I wrote a blog post about some potential tells for him that I thought, I had I had pretty good confidence were behavioral patterns for him. And, I tweeted at him and he was like, "Oh, thanks for the write up." And, I don't know if that was even actually him, but, I think he was kind of popular immediately after that, but I've never had anybody say anything bad to me, and I think if anything they would appreciate it, because it's not like these things are really that hard to fix. I think a lot of times they're just blind spots, for example, the Pius Hines thing I wrote about, the eye contact thing. It's like I have a feeling like he either was aware of that before I noticed it. Somebody told him, a friend told him or something, or he saw mine and he was like, "Oh, okay, I won't do that anymore." And it's just a matter of being aware of these things, because I think a lot of times players have a blind spot. It's like it's really hard to keep track of all your behavioral stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. It's like you're betting, you're trying to observe your opponent a little bit. You're watching the board. You got all these factors going on. I mean, a poker hand's pretty complex with all these points of that could easily lead to somebody having a blind spot, even an experienced player. So I think it's nothing to be ashamed of, and I think once you realize that, it's pretty easy to shut that down, whatever that leak is. So I don't think anybody, that's probably the reason why nobody's ever, gotten mad at me, because I think they would just be like, oh, okay, well, I learned from that and I won't do that anymore. And anybody, if an opponent thinks they're going to do that, then the joke would be on them because they probably fixed that leak, right?
Yeah.
So,
one of the most irritating things in poker is there are certain few players who tank for a really long time before acting. And I think a lot of that does have to do with not giving away any tells, maybe timing tells or whatever. And they'll move their chips in, the exact same way every time. But it's almost gotten to the point where there's just a few certain players who just tank forever. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Other than finding it, really hard to watch, I agree. I think part of it's an effort to limit the bet timing tells, because once you make it a decision more immediately than another decision, it can theoretically be exploitable, because somebody could theoretically find some information on that, because immediate calls and immediate bets are like two of the most important bet timing patterns, they're where the most information can be drawn from when somebody makes an immediate bet or an immediate call. So, it's understandable that somebody, a really serious player playing against really serious competition, he doesn't want to open himself up to that exploitation. So, it's kind of like, well, I'm going to make every decision take as long as my longest decision needs to be, that's kind of what the mindset there. And I've been there before too. It's kind of like, I'm like, I don't want to potentially rush the decision and give away information that way by making it seem like it was obvious or whatever, whatever my decision was. So it's like the motivation is there to take as long as your longest decision needs to be. But then it gets to be pretty ridiculous as we've seen, it's like, that's why, I'm fully behind some way to limit that amount of time, because it's just, I even playing in these, I just played in the $300 tournament the other day, and it was like the second tournament I've played in a year and a half, and it was just ridiculous how long every hand took. And these are just pretty amateur players too, but I think it's kind of like they're emulating what they see, in a lot of these televised tournaments,
Mm-hmm.
And Trisha actually mentioned an article the other week that I think you'd sent her regarding the importance of how people push the chips in rather than how people look on their faces in terms of tells. Do you have any comments on that one?
Yeah, that was a study that they did at Stanford. I think there are reliable, meaningful information you can gain from the way people bet. I think in general it's a pretty weakly reliable tendency, or the information isn't that great, on average. But I think there is information there, and there can definitely be information, per player specific information. But I think that's another reason you see players being very deliberate with their actions. They take a long time. They are very slow and methodical with how they put the chips in the pot, because they don't want to potentially give away any information. And actually, I'll say I worked with one player who I won't name, but one of the things I noticed on him was something he did where the way he was putting his chips in the pot, it was the only thing I could notice on him where I felt like there was variance in what he was doing. And it kind of fit actually with that study, because it was a more non-smooth movement. The unsmooth movements were more correlated to bluffs or weak hands when he bet. So it was kind of related to what that study was saying. And for that player, that was the only thing I was able to find. And when I brought it up to him, he said, "Oh yeah, you're right. I thought I was really balanced with how I behaved, but I never really thought about like the actual movement and how I put the chips into the pot. That was one. It was kind of like a blind spot kind of thing again, where it was one area where he had focused on a lot of other areas and trying to remain balanced, but that was one area where he hadn't really, thought about that much at all, and hadn't spent time, focusing on keeping that balanced."
So for home games, this could be, really, really important. If you're playing the same guys every week and you pick up a tell on somebody, or someone has a weakness like that, it could really be the difference between them having a profitable and unprofitable year.
Oh, for sure. I play in this regular 2-5 game, has a straddle, so it plays a bit bigger sometimes. But, I play with a lot of regular players, and I've been taking notes on them, for the last year or two, almost 2 years, I think. Some of them. And, like some of the tells I've collected on these guys are, really reliable and really powerful. They make the difference for me, like making a big call or folding, in a lot of spots. And, for some players, it's much more meaningful than others. Like the players that it's the most meaningful for are just like way more obvious than they should be, considering that they're regular players. But yeah, it can make a big difference. I've got many notes I've taken where these kinds of things play into my decision, and I either call or fold or raise or whatever based on those things,
A lot of times during the World Series, I'll play events where it'll have a very high proportion of, amateur or more recreational players. And when you get a good tell on them, sometimes it's 100%. You can take it to the bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the greatest feeling, I think, or one of the best feelings. It's good to play strong competition too and beat them, but but it's definitely enjoyable to have a really nice read on someone where you just feel like you're getting away with something, and it makes the game so much more exciting. Where you're like, oh, that's information I should never have had, but now I can use it.
And there'll be a lot of guys out there who play pretty much just online, but then they travel to the World Series, and it's really worthwhile them looking at your work and thinking over this, because if you're not used to playing live, you're definitely not going to have the skill set, are you?
That was one of the things with for example, P.S. Hines, when I studied his behavior, the reason I focused so much on him, and I was actually went on my way to study him because I knew that he was an experienced online player, but that he hadn't played much live, hardly at all. So that was the reason I kind of felt confident that I would find something on him, and I wasn't too surprised when I found something on him because I knew he had that background. But yeah, I think it's I think a lot of online players sometimes underestimate the importance of these things. I don't think it's super valuable to be able to spot poker tells even necessarily. I think the main value comes in just being aware that it can be important and being able to limit your own tells, because I think a lot of online players, as skilled as some of them are, that can be a blind spot for them where they're just not used to thinking about that stuff. And so they're very skilled in the strategy, obviously, but they're just not aware of all the many ways they could potentially be leaking information. And then, if somebody's super skilled live wise, like Phil Ivey or somebody, even if, or some other player, it's like that could make a big difference because they could be spotting something that the online only player, it just doesn't know that he's giving away. It's just a blind spot,
And I guess that's something in terms of a defensive strategy, it's probably going to be easier to know what you shouldn't do yourself than necessarily pick up enough of that information from other people, if you're an experienced live.
Yeah, I would definitely, I would think, for an online focused player who's new to live, the much more important thing is defensive, is eliminating your own tells, reducing them as much as possible. Once you get more comfortable, you can start looking for tells, but I would say, that's kind of like the icing on the cake. But I think, not being aware of your own tells opens you up to exploitation, I think a lot more, and it has a much bigger potential downside than, studying other people's tells.
Yeah, I think speaking of going back to the way people move the chips in the pot, if people want to see somebody who I feel like moves the chips the exact same way every time, they should check out maybe some videos of David Doc Sands, because he has this almost crane looking movement he does with his chips. I don't know if you've noticed that or if you have any thoughts on it, but
no,
it seems like that's what he does.
I'll check that out. Yeah, I haven't watched him recently. I haven't seen any video with him. That's a good.
Well, if you watch him, you're gonna see that he has this certain way. And I actually heard somebody say that just watching him do that was the most tilt-inducing thing they'd ever seen.
He's got a double strength from it. Then he's balancing his range and upsetting his opponents. So
yeah, exactly. Now I gotta see this. I wouldn't incorporate it. Maybe it's similar to something I saw. I saw this. It was somebody in an EPT tournament. He had this. It was the weirdest way of setting chips into the pot I've ever seen, and I tweeted about it. I was like, "What is this?" And he was just making this big, he would set his hand out, I think maybe it is the same thing, because he extended his arm out over the table and just released his chips with a big plop.
Yep, that's him. And it looks like
a foot over the table. Yeah, it was like a crane. Right. Then he just released it with a plop. It was. It must be the same thing, because I saw it. I was like, "What the hell is he doing?" But he was a really good player. I can't remember who it was now, but it was just so silly. I was like, is this the new thing? Maybe it is.
I feel confident we're talking about the same person. And yeah, he's a great player technically, but he tanks a lot and he does the crane thing. So he's definitely gifted at putting people on tilt.
I think it might have been Davide Katai. It might have been him. He's Kitbull on Twitter. I think it might have been. I'd never seen anybody do that consistently, where that seemed to be a thing he was doing, and it was just so weird. It was almost like to me, I would use that if I was like trying to make somebody laugh and get a reaction or something. I hadn't thought about it in a while actually, but maybe I'll try to do that next time I play.
And I mean, thinking about the watching the videos, if you could talk through, how you found this information, the database, the hours. So, what sort of work did you put in for these books?
Yeah, I put in a large amount. On the first book, it was much more. My first book was much more experience driven. It was more like a culmination of things I'd thought about and taken notes about over the past years. But the second book, Verbal Poker Tells, I spent a much longer time researching that and collecting the hand histories in that one. And I watched, for months, I watched probably like hundreds of hours of televised footage, just collecting with a focus on poker shows that had amateur players in it. I spent a long time collecting all these instances of verbal behavior just so I would have a good database of verbal behavior and things to talk about. And while I was logging them, I came up with a system of like categorizing verbal behavior and a system for, while I was doing it, I was categorizing some physical behavior as I went just to have in the database. So it was like these codes I created just on my own that would correspond to different behaviors, different verbal behaviors, different statements, and different physical behaviors. So then it would make it easier to go back and go through the spreadsheet and, kind of find any behavior I look for. I could find examples of it and find, where it occurred. And, if I wanted to, I could do a more in-depth study of how these things were showing up. So that was really helpful. It took a long time to build. Like I worked on Verbal Poker Tells for 8 months straight. Like that was all I was working on for 40 to 50 hours a week. It was a lot of work. I think it's paying off now because I'm starting to think of other uses for building this database, just because I have all this footage logged and trying to think of other ways to make use of it. It was a lot of work. I'm not really sure if it was, if it was really, really worth it financially, but it was fun and I learned a lot.
But for the poker players out there, Zach's done the work for you already. you don't have to watch those hundreds of hours, read the books and take the shortcut, I guess, is the advice.
Yeah, I learned a lot writing it, for what it's worth. I mean, I didn't think I would learn as much as I did just collecting the information and writing about it, but I learned a lot.
Now, you also have a chapter that's going to be in Jonathan Little's Excelling at No Limit Hold'em book, which is coming out in June. Can you just give us a little summary of what you wrote about in that chapter?
Sure. As do you guys.
Yep.
I understand. Everyone's got a chapter.
Yeah.
I wrote about, it was just kind of an overview. It was kind of a short overview of everything I felt were the most important things to look for at the table. It was kind of like taking everything into account across the board, like skilled players, inexperienced players, whatever. It was kind of just an overview of the things I felt were the most important tells, basically, and things to look for. So it's kind of
For people going out to the series, they can pick up this and that'll give them, at least like a little bit of a cheat sheet, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's, not to toot my own horn too much, but I thought it was a really good overview of, what information is important, what behavioral information is important and why it's important, kind of an understanding of a little bit, why is this important, not just this is important. So I thought it was a good brief explanation of all those things in a pretty short span of time. And it also was kind of more probably helpful than even maybe my first book, because I think some of my thoughts on some of the behavior has evolved a bit since I wrote my first book in 2012. So it's kind of like a more up-to-date version of some of those things. I think I talk about some of the things a little bit differently, and just because I've thought about things differently recently. So I think it's a good, definitely a good overview of Poker Tells in general.
And then if online players are thinking of going out to the series, I know we were speaking before the show, you mentioned that you've got videos that you're making as well that are actually showing the behaviours. Can you explain to us about those?
Right. Well, I've got a few free YouTube videos on my YouTube channel that anybody can watch. I think I've got like 12 or something, not too many. Some of it's including WSOP footage. People might find it interesting. And that's just on my YouTube channel, which is like youtube.com/ReadingPokerTells, I think. And then I'm working now. I've got a couple guides up that are PDF guides on my site that actually are accompaniments to some televised tournament footage. That the guides are basically like you can read them as you watch the online footage, and I bring the reader's attention to interesting behavioral spots and situations. So I got a couple of those up, and I may make some more soon. But I thought those guides were pretty unique and practical. I think like probably more practical than a lot of other stuff I've written, just because it's focused so much more on real players and real behavior, and you can see for yourself the behavior, and you can read my thoughts anyway on why I think it's important, and and you can reach your own conclusions too if you disagree with me or whatever. But it's all just there for you to see, and I also talk about the specific situation where the behavior is showing up and how it might be useful if you were maybe the opponent in that hand or something like that. So yeah, my more recent work has been on making stuff that's much more practically focused, and when I'm playing live too, I take notes on things on like why was that behavior practically useful for me, and why did it help sway a decision I was making. And I've also recently partnered with somebody with some poker footage, and I'm going to be making some poker videos out of that, some instructional poker videos. And that's kind of a long-term thing. It might take me a while to get them out, so I don't want to talk too much about them. But yeah, that'll be down the line a bit.
So there's information out there, everybody. So if you haven't looked at that before the World Series, you don't deserve to win. I think it's free information. Like, do your homework.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's no reason not to, and I don't like to overestimate these things. It's like once you know about it, it's pretty easy to prevent giving away tells and stuff. So there's no reason to not look into it, I think.
It's a game of small edges, and this is just just like the work me and Trisha do. The mindset is an edge in the game. Tells are another edge in the game that people really want to be taking advantage of, because it does all add up in the end, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Every little, I think serious players are looking for every little small edge, and a lot of that edge comes against stems from, your more inexperienced competition, and so that's where tells can play the most part, I think.
So for people who want to keep up with you and they want to, find out about your materials and things that you have available, where should they go to find you?
Oh, just at my site, ReadingPokerTells.com. And it might be a good place to mention that I've got a blog post on there with a session I did with you, Elliot, where I did a little hypnotherapy session. One single session with you when I was in Vegas last year, or was it the year before? Last year, yeah.
Last year, I think. Yeah. So lots of it was really in depth. Actually, I was really impressed. Really impressed with your write up. I think you explained it better than I do. I really appreciated that one.
I have oversharing gene.
And then we can't let you go without you telling us. So you've probably seen more more poker footage than anyone else. We're a mindset podcast. What's the worst tilt you've seen, or one that really stands out in your mind where someone's behavior is just shocking?
Oh, geez. Well, one of the major ones that come to mind is just that huge blow up from like the WSOP when they're all the main event where there are only a few players left. I can't remember. It's like an epic one where this guy just fell apart and gave away all his chips, and he was like a big chip leader. Oh, I can't remember his name now though. If I search for major blowups and WSOP main event, I'm sure it'll come up though. I mean, like, was it
Brandon Cantu by chance? Was it the year that he had the 10-5 against the aces? Is that the one you're thinking of?
No, I actually don't know that one. But wait, I think I've got it here.
Well, while you're looking, Brendan Cantu, he's such an interesting player, and he is not afraid to gamble it up. And so if viewers or listeners want to go check it out, I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. He makes some interesting plays, and he had a very large chip stack, and it was towards the end, and there was a 10-5 offsuit hand. I think it was offsuit that ended up. I don't think he busted that hand, but he's definitely crippled on that hand. So
what year did you say that was?
Gosh, I cannot remember. It's been a few years. I can't tell you the exact year. It's been a while, but if you type in Brandon Cantu, maybe WSOP blow up, I bet you could find it.
Oh, well, then there was I think the guy I was thinking of was named Scott something. I feel like, but the other one was, when I was searching for that, the Philip Helm one was from 2007. I don't know if you remember that one. That one was kind of sad because Philip Helm, he had maintained such composure, and he was playing really well, and then he just went into this downward spiral where he gave away all his chips. Hope he's not listening, because I'd hate to rub that in again. But yeah, I mean, there's just lots of examples of, and I've been there myself. I've been, I've only played a handful of tournaments. I mean, probably less than 50 significant stake ones, and I've definitely been in that spot a few years ago, when I wasn't that experienced at tournaments, where it's kind of like I think the things that have stuck in my mind is seeing the happy tilt. I don't know what you guys would call that. When you're feeling on top of the world and you can do no wrong, and then you just make a whole bunch of questionable plays because you're oh, I'm going to outplay everybody, Those are the ones that stick in my head, and those are the two I've mentioned just now were both examples of that, where the player was doing really well and everyone was, talking about them oh, they're going to have a good chance of winning this, and then they just blow up and give away a bunch of chips,
Painful after.
It could definitely happen.
It's painful to watch, and it's painful to live through, just in the even in the small stakes tournaments I've played in, where a few $100 buy-in or whatever. And I've definitely lived through that myself.
Yeah, these are cautionary tales. We don't talk about anyone to, pick on them, but just to make people aware of, all sorts of psychological issues that can go on at the table.
Oh, yeah. There's so many. Yeah. And that's why, I think your book, Patricia, was valuable. And, all these, talking about mental game is just so important. I always said, if these kinds of books were around when I was playing more seriously back in 2003, 2004, 2005, they would have addressed a lot of problems I had back then, because I was prone to a lot of mental game issues, and complex ones. I don't really even fully understand some of the stuff that would make me play bad, but I think as you guys know, there's just all sorts of weird things that can get in the way of playing your best
and
at all times.
A huge amount of money can be won or lost just purely on mindset. Technical ability takes you so far, but if you get stressed and punt away all your chips, it's not relevant.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thanks so much for coming on, Zach. Really, everyone, check out Zach's website. That's ReadingPokerTells.com. And we'll see you at the World Series.
I'm not sure if I'll be there this year.
Then I won't.
I'll try. Yeah, I'll try to. It'll be. I've been the last few years, but I'll try to make it down. Down. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks, Tricia. And where can people find out about you?
They can follow me over on Twitter at Dr. Tricia Cardner. They can find Positive Poker at Amazon.com, and they can check out my website, drtriciacardner.com.
And if people are interested in my products or services, I'm at pokermindcoach.com. And again, Zach is readingpokertells.com. We look forward to talking to all of you guys next week.
Thanks, guys.